The horse fell first. Not from exhaustion, not from injury. He simply stopped moving, his legs bent beneath his body, his eyes open and fixed on the absolute whiteness of the snow. The rider descended slowly, his fingers numb with feeling, his face covered in ice that formed with each breath. He looked at the horizon. There was nothing. Only wind. Only silence. Only that vast white expanse that seemed to swallow everything that existed. He was a messenger for Genghis Khan's army. He had set out 3 days earlier with an urgent message for the northern camp, but the storm arrived without warning, as all storms did in that place. And now, he was alone, without a horse, without fire, without any point of reference on the horizon. A man trained all year for this, a Mongol, and yet the steppe was trying to kill him. What happened next would forever change how the world understood survival. But to understand that moment, we need to go back. Long before the ice, long before the wind, we need to go back to the beginning of a civilization that learned to live where no other could even survive. A civilization that not only withstood the most brutal winter on Earth, but also used that winter as a weapon to conquer half the known world. This is the story of the Mongols, and it begins long before any battle. It begins one morning before dawn, when a woman wakes in the dark cold of the Mongolian steppe, pulls the sheep's wool blanket from her face, observes the breath rising like smoke in the icy air, and gets up, without hesitation, without complaint, because in that world, the cold was not a problem. It was simply the day. The Mongol world was not kind to anyone. It was not kind to children. It was not kind to the elderly. It was not kind to animals, to plants, to dreams, or to weakness. The steppe was the largest grassy desert on the planet, a place where the wind never truly stopped, where the horizon stretched in every direction, offering no shade, no shelter, and no promise. In summer, the sun burned mercilessly. In winter, temperatures dropped so low that livestock froze while standing. Entire rivers disappeared under layers of ice thick enough to support the weight of an army. And the Mongols lived there, not because they had no choice, but because that place had made them so. Every aspect of Mongol civilization can be traced back to this brutal reality. Every custom, every skill, every military strategy, every social structure. Everything stemmed from the need to survive in an environment that tested the limits of what a human being can endure. Let's start with what seems simplest, but is actually the foundation of everything. The dwelling. For most people in the medieval world, the idea of security was linked to stone, high walls, heavy wooden doors, castles, citadels, fortresses. The logic was straightforward. You build something permanent, something the weather can't destroy, and you survive. The Mongols completely reversed this logic. The ger, which many know by its Turkish name, yurt, was not just a tent. It was one of the most sophisticated survival inventions any civilization has ever produced. From the outside, it looked simple, a circular structure covered in felt, with an opening at the top. But every detail had been refined by centuries of accumulated experience in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The circular shape wasn't just for aesthetics, it was engineering. Winds that would topple a rectangular structure simply slid off the curved surface of the gyre without encountering resistance. The pressure was distributed evenly. A well-built gyre could withstand storms that destroyed much larger and seemingly more solid structures. The felt on the outside wasn't just any fabric. It was made from compressed sheep's wool in specific layers, a material with surprising thermal properties. In winter, it retained heat with remarkable efficiency. In summer, it kept the interior cooler than the outside. Families added extra layers during the harshest winter. They removed layers in the heat. The very structure of the house responded to the seasons. The central fire was not merely for heating. It was the symbolic and practical heart of every Mongolian family. There were strict rules about fire. You couldn't point a knife at it. You couldn't throw garbage into it. You couldn't step on the ashes. The fire represented the continuity of the family, the link between the living and the ancestors, the promise that the next morning would come. Children learn these rules before learning anything else, because the fire was sacred, and because without it, at that temperature, the night was fatal. But the most extraordinary detail of the jar was not its design. It was the fact that it could be completely disassembled and reassembled in less than an hour. An experienced family could do it even faster. The wooden frame separated into pieces that could be carried by camels or oxen. The felt was rolled into compact cylinders. Everything had its place. Everything had its system. And this system meant that the Mongols were never imprisoned. While the armies of Europe, Persia, and China depended on cities, warehouses, and fixed supply routes, the Mongols carried everything with them. Their home was their fortress. Their mobility was their armor. Now think about what that meant strategically. When a conventional army prepared for winter, they sought walls. They sought shelter. They stopped moving. The cold immobilized them as much as it immobilized their enemies. But the Mongols continued, because for them, winter was not a pause in life. It was just another season that demanded adaptation. And while medieval courts closed their doors, awaiting the spring thaw, steppe knights crossed frozen rivers that would have been insurmountable barriers during the summer. Winter itself became a road. This brings us back to the messenger. That man lying in the snow with his dead horse beside him wasn't necessarily doomed, because he had grown up learning something no medieval European book taught. He had learned that panic kills faster than cold. The first thing to do when the situation is desperate is to stop, breathe, think. He turned the horse's body over using the last of his arm's strength, not out of respect, for survival. A dead horse is thermal mass, its protection against the wind, its heat that lasts for hours before dissipating completely. He clung to the animal's flank, using his large body as a barrier, covered his face with the inside of his del, the long Mongolian tunic made of layers of felt and wool, and waited. That ability to think coldly in a situation of literal freezing was no accident. It was the product of an entire culture built on a philosophy that few peoples in history have been able to uphold. Don't fight what you can't control. Adapt to it. The Mongols didn't have an exact word for the concept that the Romans called lust, or that medieval Europeans called comfort. Not because they were simple or primitive, but because those ideas didn't make sense on the steppe. Comfort was a distraction. Lust was a burden you carried when you needed to be light. Every object a family possessed had to justify its own weight. If it wasn't useful, it didn't exist. This created a mindset radically different from any sedentary civilization. Consider how a medieval European nobleman prepared his son for life. Education in Latin, table manners, strategy in games, perhaps some sword training in a protected courtyard. Now consider how a Mongol prepared his child. Before the age of 3, a child was already on horseback, not as a passenger, but as an apprentice. The child was initially tied to the saddle, but not for safety, but for habituation. The goal was for the child's body to learn the horse's rhythm before their mind had time to become afraid. Before the age of 5, most Mongolian children could already walk without assistance. Before 10, they were able to ride for hours at a time. Before 12, many were already participating in royal hunts, not as spectators, but as active participants. Hunting was the second most important military training exercise for the Mongol civilization. The Nurg, the great collective hunt, was simultaneously a social spectacle, a source of food, and the best simulation of war that the steppe offered. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of hunters organized themselves in a huge circle around an area of steppe. Over days, this circle slowly closed, compressing the animals towards the center. The coordination required was extraordinary. Communication without words. Synchronized movements between groups that sometimes couldn't even see each other. Control of the horse on unstable terrain. Quick decision-making when an animal tried to break the line. All of this was war. It just didn't have a name. And at the center of this preparation, at the heart of everything that made the Mongols possible, was the horse. Not just any horse. The Mongolian horse is one of the most extraordinary creatures that evolution has ever produced in partnership with human selection. To the European eyes that first encountered them during campaigns of conquest, these animals seemed almost disappointing. They were smaller than the European destriers, the great war horses of the Crusades and medieval tournaments. They were less elegant, less impressive to behold. But those European travelers very quickly discovered that they were wrong about almost everything they thought they knew about horses. The Mongolian horse had not been bred to look powerful. It had been bred for the steppe to survive. Centuries of brutal winters and scorching summers had eliminated every trace of frailty. What remained was an animal with short, thick legs like young tree trunks, an expanded rib cage that processed rarefied air with surprising efficiency, and hooves that seemed almost carved from stone. They were so strong. In winter, when snow covered the grass, European horses would starve. They needed stored hay, heated stables, and constant care. The Mongolian horse would lower its head and use its hooves to dig through the snow, finding the frozen grass beneath. It could do this for hours. This meant that a Mongolian army in winter didn't need to carry food for its horses. The horses found their own food in terrain that any European army would have considered a supply disaster. But the truly impressive detail wasn't the animal's physical resilience. It was the system the Mongols had built around it. Each Mongol warrior on campaign traveled with a mount, not a spare horse. Several. Numbers vary by source, but conservative estimates suggest that each elite cavalryman kept between 3 and 5 horses in constant rotation. On larger campaigns, this number could be higher. The logic was simple but revolutionary. Even the most resilient horse has its limits. At a forced pace, a European destrier would exhaust its reserves in 1 or 2 days of intense training. The rider, the horseman, then became dependent on food, rest, farriers, and all the support infrastructure that medieval armies dragged along in the form of baggage trains that were sometimes larger than the armies themselves. The Mongols simply switched horses. The tired animal followed alongside, trotting lightly, recovering while the rider continued at full speed on the new animal. When this second horse showed signs of fatigue, a third was called in for the remount. The cycle continued. The result was speed that bordered on the unbelievable by medieval standards. Mongol armies on the march could cover distances that European forces would take weeks to cross, and they arrived on the other side relatively fresh, ready for battle, while the defenders were still trying to organize their lines. This is the moment when the story becomes truly shocking. During the invasion of Eastern Europe in the 13th century, there are records of Mongol columns covering over 100 kilometers in a single day. Not just once, repeatedly, for consecutive days. Cities would receive news that the invaders had been sighted 3 days' distance away, and then the Mongols would arrive the next day. The warning systems, which had worked for every army Europe had ever known, simply weren't designed for that speed. Think about what that did psychologically. You are a medieval commander. You have spies and corridors and messaging systems. You receive information that an enemy force has been sighted at a considerable distance. You have time to prepare. You have time to reinforce walls, gather supplies, evacuate civilians, and position troops. But the Mongols arrived before you finished formulating the plan. Not because they were magicians, because they had horses. Lots of horses. And a system for using those horses that no other people had developed on the same scale. Communication was equally revolutionary. The YAM, the Mongol messenger station system, was probably the most efficient long-distance communication system the world had seen up to that point. Every few kilometers along the empire's main routes, there was a station with fresh horses and ready riders. A messenger would arrive, deliver the message or sealed pouch, and a new rider would immediately set off on the fresh horse. The original messenger would rest while the message continued. Information could cross continental distances in a fraction of the time it would take by any other means. This meant that Genghis Khan or his successors could coordinate military operations happening simultaneously in territories separated by thousands of kilometers. This coordination was impossible for any other empire of the time, because no other empire had solved the fundamental problem of rapid communication on the scale that the yam did. And behind every yam, every messenger, every post, and every kilometer traveled was the Mongolian horse. Tireless, adapted, built by the steppe over centuries to do exactly what the Mongols needed it to do. But let's get back to the people. Because horses were extraordinary, but it was humans who made them so devastating. A woman wakes before sunrise on the steppe. She has no name recorded by history, but she existed, and her existence was the foundation of everything the outside world called the Mongol conquest. While the men rode, hunted, waged war and traded, she managed the daily reality that made it all possible. This brings us to one of the biggest surprises of Mongol civilization for the outside world. Women. Persian, Arab, European and Chinese travelers who came into contact with Mongol society invariably recorded a specific type of culture shock. It wasn't the kind of shock that came from violence or the strangeness of customs. It was the deeper shock that comes from seeing a set of fundamental assumptions simply not hold true. In most of the medieval world, the structure was clear. Women lived in confined spaces. Their value was measured by their usefulness to male families. Their opinions on politics, commerce, war, or religion were irrelevant by definition. There were exceptions, of course. There always are. But these were exceptions that prove the rule. On the Mongolian steppe, the rule was different. And the reason for this was as simple as it was brutal. When your entire civilization depends on constant movement, when every family member needs to carry their own weight, when winter can kill half the livestock in a week, and you need every available hand to immediately reorganize your life, you simply don't have the luxury of considering half your population as merely decorative. Mongolian women managed the gers. This sounds simple until you understand what managing a jar really meant. It meant controlling the family's food supplies. It meant negotiating with other camps when supplies ran low. It meant deciding when to move, where to move, and which route was safest at that season. It meant keeping the livestock organized, the feed in good condition, and the provisions calculated to last the winter. When the men were absent, which often happened for months during military campaigns or long hunts, the women not only kept the camps running, they expanded them. They made alliance decisions with neighboring camps, resolved disputes, and protected the children from threats ranging from natural predators to rival groups. And the Mongolian women rode horses. This may seem like a small detail. It's not. In medieval Europe, a woman on horseback was a specific image: noble, riding sideways, surrounded by squires, going from one castle to another, never alone, never at speed, never on difficult terrain. A Mongolian woman on horseback was something else entirely. She was someone who had learned to ride as early as her brothers, who could travel alone over distances that European nobles would consider an expedition, who used the horse as a tool for work, communication, and survival. Mobility created a form of independence that was structurally impossible for women in sedentary societies. You can't physically control someone who can simply ride away. You can't confine someone whose skills you genuinely need to survive. There are records of some Mongolian women who became political figures of considerable importance. Some acted as regents during periods of dynastic instability. Others exerted influence over military and diplomatic decisions in ways external sources recorded with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. A 13th-century Arabic source described the wife of a Mongol leader as someone who commanded the respect of ambassadors as much as her husband, not because she insisted on it, but because it was simply obvious to everyone present that she understood the situation as well as, or better than, any man in the room. To the Arab observer, this was shocking. To the Mongols in the room, it probably seemed perfectly normal. And now we come to the heart of the matter. to the detail that holds you back, that doesn't let go, and that transforms the way you see everything that came before and everything that will come after. The Mongolian winter was not just cold. It was a selection mechanism. For millennia, that steppe had systematically eliminated every lineage, every custom, every strategy, and every mentality that could not survive its conditions. What remained was not luck. It was the result of a brutal and relentless filtering process over generations. The skills that the Mongols considered basic, the kind of things a 10-year-old could do, were skills that the most sophisticated armies of the medieval world did not possess. Read this list carefully. An average Mongol warrior could ride a horse at full speed and fire arrows with lethal accuracy. He could navigate the steppe without any visual reference other than the stars and the wind. He could survive for days on minimal amounts of food. He could identify if a horse was developing a hoof problem before the animal showed any visible signs of lameness. He could assemble and disassemble his entire dwelling in less than an hour. He could read animal behavior to predict weather changes hours in advance. He could communicate complex tactical information to riders hundreds of meters away using only flag signals and horse movements. Each of these skills took years to develop. Many were learned in childhood as a natural part of life, not as deliberate training. For the Mongols, it was simply a matter of living. For any army that faced them, it was an incomprehensible advantage. And it was something even deeper. The psychology of the steppe created warriors who did not panic. This is rarer and more valuable than it seems. In battle, in storms, in desperate situations, the most precious resource is not the sharpest weapon or the highest wall. It is the ability to think clearly when the brain wants to scream and run. The Mongols had developed this ability, not through philosophy or meditation, but through an entire childhood of situations where panic led to death and calm led to survival. When you grow up in an environment where panicking during a snowstorm means dying lost on the steppe, you learn calmness in a way that no military academy can teach. This involuntary training created warriors who, amidst the chaos of battle while arrows flew, horses fell, and lines broke all around, retained the ability to assess the situation, communicate with their peers, and adapt their strategy in real time. For armies that relied on rigid formations and clear command hierarchies, facing this type of adversary was a disconcerting experience. The Mongols did not fight as an army were expected to fight, and by the time the enemy tried to adapt its tactics to Mongol behavior, the Mongols had already changed their behavior. Let's go back to the food, because there's something here that history books rarely explain adequately. The Mongolian diet was frequently described by medieval travelers, with that specific tone of revulsion that appears when someone encounters a dietary custom completely outside their frame of reference. Europeans and Persians recorded with horror the consumption of raw meat, blood, and fermented dairy products. Areg, fermented mare's milk, was particularly incomprehensible to visitors from traditions where alcohol came from grains and fruits. But each of these foods had an impeccable logic for survival. Dried meat, or borts, was food that could last for months without refrigeration, weighed much less than its fresh equivalent, and could be reconstituted with melted snow in minutes. A rider in the field could carry weeks' worth of supplies in his saddlebags without overburdening the animal. Arag was simultaneously hydration, nutrition, and a source of energy in a single liquid that mares produced freely while walking. A lactating mare was a resource that renewed itself daily without any additional work from the rider. Animal fat, which visitors described with revulsion, was the most efficient fuel available in an extremely cold environment. The human body at temperatures well below zero burns calories at rates that grain-based diets simply cannot sustain. Fat provided dense energy that kept the body warm from the inside out. There is an account, possibly exaggerated but entirely plausible given the logic of survival, of riders on forced marches, who would open a vein in their horse's neck, drink enough blood to maintain energy, close the cut, and continue galloping. The horse would lose a minimal amount of blood, enough to compensate for the loss within hours. The rider would receive iron, protein, and fluids without needing to stop. If this seems extreme, consider the context. These were men who needed to cross impossible distances in impossible time against enemies who had numerical and logistical advantages. In such a tight survival equation, any technique that worked was worth using. And they worked. The Mongol armies were able to maintain campaign paces that utterly exhausted any attempt at conventional logistical analysis. European generals studying the Mongol campaign centuries later often concluded that what the Mongols had accomplished simply should not have been possible with the resources available. But it was possible because the Mongols had optimized every variable they controlled: the food, the horses, the housing, the clothing, the route, the pace. Clothing deserves special attention because it perfectly illustrates how the Mongolian mind approached practical problems. The del, the long tunic that was the centerpiece of Mongolian clothing, seemed simple. It wasn't. It was a piece of textile engineering that took generations to refine. Long enough to cover the knees when riding, protecting the legs from the cold without restricting movement, with a crosslock closure that allowed for adjustment in different temperatures, with sleeves slightly longer than the arms, allowing them to be pulled over the hands in extreme cold without separate gloves. Below, layers of woolen clothing could be added or removed as the temperature changed. The leather boots with upturned toes, a design that still persists in the region, allowed for quick entry and exit from the stirrups, crucial both in combat and when you needed to dismount quickly in difficult terrain. Winter hats covered the ears and could be tied under the chin. The Mongols understood from experience, long before any science of hypothermia, that heat loss through the head was critical. Keeping the head covered was not vanity. It was basic survival. Each piece of clothing had been refined through generations of brutal feedback. What didn't work killed the person wearing it. What did work was passed on. This was the Mongol civilization in miniature, a ruthless process of selection and refinement where the evaluation criterion was simple and absolute: you survived or you didn't. And now we need to talk about winter as a weapon. Because up until now we've discussed how the Mongols survived the cold, but the most extraordinary story is how they used it. Imagine you are the commander of a medieval city. Your territory has natural boundaries: rivers in the summer, swamps that make the terrain impassable for heavy armies. You built your defenses, assuming these natural boundaries existed. In winter, the rivers freeze, the swamps harden, the terrain that would be impassable in summer becomes a firm plain beneath your feet. For you, this is an abstract concern. You assume that no army in its right mind would attack in the most brutal winter. It's too cold. The men suffer. The horses suffer. The logistics are impossible. For the Mongols, the frozen winter was literally the best road that nature could offer. In 1237, when Mongol forces under Batu Khan crossed into Russia, they used the frozen rivers as highways. The Volga, the Don, the Dnieper rivers that were natural barriers in the summer became invasion corridors in the winter. Cities that presumed to have geographical protection discovered that this protection had literally frozen and vanished. This was no accident. It was a deliberate strategy. The Mongols chose winter for certain campaigns precisely because they knew they could function in conditions that would cripple any other army. Their ability to operate in extreme cold was not just a defensive advantage, it was an offensive weapon. And there was a psychological component that is difficult to overestimate. When you see an army emerge from the frozen horizon in the dead of winter, when you had assumed that winter itself protected you, the terror it generates is not just fear of the enemy. It is the collapse of a fundamental assumption about how the world works. If they can appear in winter, when can they appear? This question, which must have echoed in courts, castles, and cities throughout the territory threatened by the Mongols, was itself a weapon. The fear of unpredictability paralyzed decisions. Commanders who didn't know when or from where the attack would come often ended up wasting resources, defending in all directions or not, defending in any direction at all, paralyzed by their inability to calculate the risk. The Mongols deliberately created this fog of uncertainty. The stories that preceded the army were often amplified and sometimes partially invented as a tactical tool. Rumors of atrocities, some true, some exaggerated, ran ahead of the Mongol forces and did the work of psychological attrition before a single warrior came within firing range. But the real basis of all this power, the foundation upon which the entire system rests, was something far more human. It was the community. The basic unit of Mongolian society was not the individual. It wasn't even the nuclear family. It was a broader group of interrelated families who shared seasonal territory, helped each other in emergencies, celebrated together, and faced the winter together. When a camp lost livestock in a storm, the neighbors shared, not out of abstract kindness, out of practical necessity, because the following winter, it could be you who lost livestock, and you would need your neighbors to remember what you had done. This system of reciprocity created bonds of interdependence that were all the stronger the harsher the environment. In medieval Europe, networks of feudalism and debt created hierarchies. On the steppe, winter created communities. And when Genghis Khan unified the various nomadic groups of the steppe under a single political structure, he was essentially scaling this system of reciprocity to the imperial level. It is no coincidence that one of his first acts as a unified leader was to decree that individual plunder was forbidden. Conquests belonged to the group, to be distributed by the leader. This principle, which sounded like mere military discipline, was in fact the same communal logic of the steppe applied to the scale of an army. You either survive together or you don't. You either share or you perish. You are either loyal or you are an enemy. These principles that the Mongols learned from winter, they applied to war, and war took them to the ends of the then-known world. The messenger survived, which is why I'm telling this story. When the storm subsided in the early morning, he left the shelter the dead horse had provided, and began to move. He didn't run. Running, in extreme cold, is fatal. Sweat freezes inside clothing and kills faster than exposure. He walked at a steady pace, generating body heat without excessive sweating, following the wind which he knew, from a lifetime of experience on the steppe, consistently blew from a specific direction at that time of year. 12 hours later, a group of hunters from the camp he had left 3 days earlier found him. He was cold, exhausted, and hungry, but he was standing. He was thinking. He was alive. He delivered his message. And so the empire continued. It had always continued like this. Not because the Mongols were invincible, not because fate favored them, but because generations of life on the steppe had created people who knew, to the deepest extent possible, how to keep going when everything around them told them to stop. The cold that killed entire armies had taught them this. Not as a philosophy lesson, as a matter of survival. And this difference between knowing something in your head and knowing something in your body, in your spine, in your hands, that keep moving when your mind wants to give up, this difference is what separates civilizations that leave their mark from those that disappear in the silence of winter. The wind on the steppe never completely stops. But those who learn to move with him, instead of against him, still exist. And the story they carry still has things to say. If you've made it this far, you're already the kind of person this channel was made for. Someone who wants to understand the world beyond the obvious, who seeks the living history beneath the history in books. If you're not yet part of this community, the subscribe button is right there. One click, and you won't miss a single chapter of what's still to come. Because we still have a lot to tell.